Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? My entire family boarded a plane to Hawaii for Christmas because my sister Jenna decided she wanted a drama-free holiday, and apparently, I was the drama. That was the exact phrase my mother used when she finally slipped up and told me what was happening after weeks of suspicious silence and vague excuses about everyone being too busy this year to plan anything together. You can imagine how it felt to realize that my parents, my siblings, their spouses, and even the cousins had booked a vacation package behind my back, all while smiling at me on the phone and pretending nothing was happening. The part that hit the hardest was not even the trip itself, because I've never been the type who needs sand and palm trees to feel like Christmas is real, but the deliberate exclusion, the whispered planning, and the way they all folded into Jenna's demand that I simply not be there, as if my absence was the only gift she wanted under her tree. This would not have been the first time Jenna pulled strings to get her way, but it was the first time the stakes felt so bold, because it was not just a dinner or a birthday gathering. It was the holiday our parents have always made into a big family tradition. They called it a once-in-a-lifetime vacation, a chance for everyone to relax after a stressful year, and they said it was better if I sat this one out because Jenna was going through a lot. She always seems to be going through a lot whenever she wants special treatment. The truth is, I could have lived with the insult if it were just a snub at a dinner table, but what burned me was the smug assumption that I would swallow it quietly, just like I have swallowed every other temporary arrangement Jenna has demanded over the years. Let me explain why this hit differently. When Jenna and her husband Evan needed a place to stay after his last job fell through, I opened my door without hesitation. They called it a short-term stopover until they got back on their feet, maybe 3 or 4 months, tops. That was almost 3 years ago. I have carried the mortgage, the taxes, and the insurance while charging them rent that was so low, it barely covered the utilities. At first, I told myself it was family, that helping them was the right thing to do, and that when the time came, they would remember who had been in their corner. But instead of gratitude, I got entitlement. Every extension became permanent, every favor turned into an expectation, and every conversation about money ended with them claiming they would catch up later. So when I found out that not only had they joined in excluding me from this holiday, but had actually led the charge by telling everyone else they would not go unless I was left out, something inside me snapped. It was not loud, not dramatic, not even visible to anyone else in that moment, but it was like a switch flipped in my brain. I stopped feeling ashamed and started feeling clear. If they could cut me out of my own family's holiday while sleeping under my roof, eating from my refrigerator, and paying a rent that was closer to charity than market rate, then why on earth was I still carrying them? That was the night I pulled out the old lease agreement I had written up for them back when I first let them move in. It was nothing fancy, just a one-page addendum making it clear that the arrangement was month to month and that either side could terminate it with 30 days' notice. They had signed it without hesitation at the time, probably assuming it was just paperwork I wanted for my files, not something I would ever use. But sitting at my kitchen table, staring at that paper, I realized it was not just a file, it was freedom. The first step I took was small, almost invisible to them, but significant to me. I went online and removed my bank card from the autopay accounts I had set up for their internet and their gas bill, things I had been covering out of convenience, because they just needed a little time. That little time had become endless, and I was done. The next step was sending them an email instead of calling or texting. I wrote, from this point forward, let's keep communication about the house in writing for clarity. Please confirm receipt. It was professional, distant, and deliberate, and I knew they would not like the change. Sure enough, the following week, when the first bill hit their account instead of mine, Jenna did not call me. She called my mother. She cried about how unfair it was, how I was suddenly changing the rules, and how this was going to ruin Christmas. Mom, of course, called me with that tone she always uses, the one that suggests I should just roll over for the sake of keeping peace. But for once, I did not apologize or explain myself. I simply said, Mom, they live in my house, they use my utilities, and they cut me out of Christmas. You can call it unfair, but I call it a beginning. And that really was just the beginning, because the moment I stopped subsidizing their life without asking for thanks, I realized just how much more power I had been sitting on without ever using it. I was no longer interested in being the quiet, responsible one who keeps the peace while everyone else gets to trample over me. That week, I stopped answering Jenna's manipulative calls, I started organizing my paperwork, and I began mapping out exactly how I was going to take back what was mine. And when I tell you that the fallout from that first step would change everything, I mean it, because the next move I made left Jenna speechless in a way I had never seen before. By the time their vacation photos started rolling into the family chat, all matching drinks and rehearsed captions about peace and gratitude, I had reached that clean mental place where you stop asking whether you are overreacting and start asking why you ever tolerated any of it, and because I operate better with receipts than with speeches, I sat down with my folder, checked dates against the lease addendum they had signed without reading carefully, and mapped a timeline that any reasonable adult would recognize as fair, because month to month means exactly that, and 30 days means exactly that, and pretending those words are decorations on paper does not turn them into decorations in real life. The same week, a certified envelope landed in my mailbox with Evan's name stamped all over it in serious block letters, the kind that make you slow down because an institution is talking. And the return address told me it was about his little side business that had somehow, without a conversation and certainly without my permission, started using my house as its official address, which, if you have ever dealt with business filings, you know can become a knot when deadlines are missed and notices go unanswered. I took a photo of the envelope front and back, logged the arrival time in an email to both Jenna and Evan, and told them the window for pickup would be 2 short afternoon slots over the next week with photo identification required. Because I am not playing courier for people who call me a problem and fly off to a resort to celebrate family unity. Mom called from the beach in that hushed rescue voice she uses when she knows she is asking for something she should not be asking for, and she said I was making waves over nothing and could I please not ruin the mood. Which would have been funny if it were not so predictable, and I told her plainly that mood is none of my business and mail with legal deadlines certainly is not a mood. And then I ended the call before she could triangulate me into another guilt loop where I end up soothing her while my boundaries dissolve into fog again. With the calendar in front of me, I drafted a simple, neutral, boring letter, the kind any property manager could recite in their sleep, and I sent it by certified mail and by email so there would be no confusion, no missing screenshots, no he said she said, just one line that mattered near the top stating that the month-to-month tenancy would terminate 30 days from the date of notice, that possession must be returned on that date at noon, that a walkthrough would occur that morning with a third-party witness present, and that failure to return keys would trigger a lock change which was already scheduled for the afternoon with a licensed locksmith. I attached the signed addendum for their convenience, which is polite code for you sign this. And I copied myself because I have learned the only adult in the story needs to treat herself like a client. I did not write a paragraph about hurt feelings or the Hawaii decision or the older history of me carrying utilities because they had cash flow issues, and I did not write anything about the silent way they made me the family villain so my sister could feel stress-free while she lounged and posed, because this was not about therapy. This was about property and choices and patterns, and the fastest way to get lost is to turn a boundary into a debate. When the email landed, it sat unopened for a few hours that felt quiet and expensive, and then Jenna finally replied with a single line that read, "You would not dare," which made me laugh out loud, not because I enjoy conflict, I actually hate it, but because the sentence captured so perfectly the way she has always understood me, as soft and negotiable and eager to be liked, a person who can be managed with a tearful story and a few sideways compliments, and the simple fact that the letter was already mailed and the locksmith already booked told me I had finally stepped out of that role and was not going back. Evan's response came later, longer and more polished, full of business-like phrases about partnership and good faith, and the holidays being a poor time for transitions. And he suggested a friendly meeting after they returned to discuss a revised rent number and a payment schedule for utilities, which might have landed a year ago when I was still repeating that family matters more than money. But now it read like an opener to another season of the same show, and I am done renewing this series. So I wrote back with a single paragraph that thanked him for his note, reminded him of the notice date, outlined the walkthrough process, and reiterated that any proposal would need to arrive in writing with a deposit in certified funds equal to 1 month of market rent, because remembering your leverage is not cruelty, it is adulthood. Mom tried again, of course she did, promising that after Christmas everyone would catch their breath and we could talk like grown-ups, which coming from her meant I would listen quietly while she told me why my boundaries were an overreaction. And I told her that grown-ups follow agreements they sign, and when she pushed for a phone call I declined it because calls generate fog and emails produce light, and I like light. By the end of the week, the autopays I had removed became real in their bank account. The certified letter delivery showed as received at their forwarding address in Honolulu. The locksmith confirmed the calendar slot with a neat little reminder. And I realized I was calm in a way I had not been in years, because doing the responsible thing for yourself has a way of settling your stomach more than any family truce ever could, and because the first domino had tipped, I was ready for the reaction. I knew was coming, the kind that usually knocks me off balance, except this time I had rails to hold on to and timestamps for everything, so when Jenna's next message popped up with a threat disguised as a question, I just let it sit there. Because the only answer she was going to get was already traveling toward her in 2 forms of delivery, and she could read it as many times as she needed. The day after they returned from Hawaii, all tan smiles and carry-on luggage stuffed with souvenirs they had no business affording while still owing me back rent. The family group chat lit up like fireworks with carefully curated photos and dramatic captions about memories that would last forever, and while they basked in their own image of unity, I sat in my kitchen with a stack of paperwork so unassuming it would bore most people to death, but to me it felt like armor, because every clause, every signature, every timestamp on those pages proved I was not the unreasonable one. I was the only one who had ever treated this arrangement like it mattered. And now the same paperwork they dismissed as technicalities was about to shape their reality in ways they had never considered possible. Jenna called first, not to apologize, not to explain, not even to acknowledge the certified letter she had signed for, but to launch into her usual high-pitched performance about how I was ruining her life, how the timing was cruel, and how family was supposed to work things out over dinner, not over legal documents, and she spoke as if the entire history of her freeloading had never happened, as if the bills I had carried, the groceries I had stocked, the endless extensions I had granted were all air, invisible and meaningless, while her sudden panic now deserved urgent rescue. But I stayed quiet until she was done, and then I said slowly and clearly that the notice was valid, the date was firm, and all further communication must be in writing. Because the days of crying phone calls and guilt-soaked negotiations were over. Her silence on the other end was not real silence. It was the stunned pause of someone who has lost her script, and she finally hung up without another word, which told me more than any argument could, because if Jenna had believed her own story, she would have kept fighting, but she knew as well as I did that the paper was stronger than her voice this time. That night, Evan tried a different tactic, sending me a carefully worded email filled with legalistic phrases he must have copied from some website, warning me that sudden termination of housing could be considered retaliation or harassment, and that they might need to consult counsel. And while the old me might have panicked at the word counsel, this version of me opened my folder, attached the signed month-to-month lease addendum, the 30-day notice letter, and the time-stamped certified mail receipt, and replied with a single line that said, "All terms are consistent with state law. Please refer to Section 4 of your signed agreement." I knew he would hate that I did not rise to the bait, that I did not offer apologies or explanations, because people like Evan thrive on dragging you into endless back-and-forth debates where they can wear you down with technicalities until you finally give up. But this time I had chosen silence as my sharpest weapon, because silence leaves no hooks for manipulation, and silence forces them to face the paper, not me. Meanwhile, my parents were pulled into the performance like unwilling extras, with Mom calling me 3 times in one day, crying that Jenna and Evan had nowhere to go and that I was heartless for throwing family into the street right after the holidays, and Dad adding his quiet grunts of disapproval in the background, as if those noises carried the weight of moral authority. And I reminded them both that Jenna and Evan had jobs, they had income, and they had known for weeks that the termination date was approaching, so if they had not prepared, that was not a tragedy. It was a choice, and when Mom tried to spin it back on me, saying I should give them a few more months until things settled down, I calmly repeated the phrase that had become my shield. The date is firm. The more I leaned on the paper, the louder their emotional storm became, but the louder it grew, the clearer I felt, because for the first time in years, I was not improvising or defending myself in circles. I was simply enforcing a rule that had existed all along, and that shift in dynamic rattled them in ways I had never seen, because suddenly the one they had always counted on to bend and absorb the damage was no longer available, and instead they were up against the cold, flat authority of documents they had once dismissed as just for formality. To ensure there was no chance of being painted as reckless, I scheduled a professional storage company to be on standby in case they abandoned belongings, and I hired a neutral third-party inspector to walk through the property with me on move-out day, documenting every wall, every carpet stain, every appliance, so that when they tried, as I knew they would, to claim I had stolen or damaged something, I would have airtight records to protect myself, and I cannot describe the relief that came from outsourcing those risks, because for once, I did not have to carry the weight of their chaos alone. When Jenna realized I was not responding to her endless texts, she escalated by sending group messages filled with half-truths, claiming I was making them homeless out of spite, that I was holding their belongings hostage, and that I was destroying family bonds, and I resisted the urge to jump in and correct every lie, because I knew the more I explained, the more it would look like I was on trial, and I had decided I was not on trial, not anymore. Instead, I replied only once in the group thread, attaching the notice letter and the lease addendum, with a single caption, "For clarity, here are the terms they signed." Then I muted the chat. The backlash came quickly, with cousins sending side messages asking if it was really true, if I had finally snapped, if I had thought about how this would look, and all I said was that agreements matter, that adults honor signatures, and that kindness without boundaries turns into abuse, and whether they believed me or not, I no longer cared, because the beauty of paper and silence is that they do not depend on being believed. They simply stand there, immovable, undeniable, waiting for the date circled on the calendar. The night before the deadline, as I was washing dishes and savoring the calm that comes when you have already chosen your side and stopped negotiating with yourself, I heard the faint scrape of the porch door and found an envelope slipped under it with one house key taped to the front and a sticky note scrawled in Evan's handwriting that said extension, as if one word written in desperation could erase 30 days of notices, witnesses, and preparation. But instead of rage, I felt something close to amusement, because the porch camera had caught every second of the act, the envelope timestamped itself by existing, and the law had already decided that an extension was not theirs to grant. And in that moment, standing in my own kitchen, holding their final attempt at manipulation in the form of a flimsy sticky note, I realized they had finally understood what I had known since the first envelope left my hands. That paper beats performance. Silence beats pleading, and the only power they ever had over me was the belief that I would never dare to use the tools I had all along. The morning of the walkthrough arrived with a weight that should have made me nervous, because technically this was the kind of day that can spiral into shouting, tears, or even threats, yet I felt almost unnervingly calm. Not because I enjoyed confrontation, but because every single step had been thought out in advance, documented in writing, and backed by witnesses who had no personal stake in the drama, which meant that for once I did not have to rely on my parents' approval. My sisters. mood, or my brother-in-law's stories to validate my choices, and the only authority that mattered was the stack of papers in my folder and the locksmith's appointment waiting on the calendar for noon sharp. When Jenna and Evan arrived, they were late, of course, dragging their feet and hoping, I suspect, that I would panic about time and give them a grace period, but instead I greeted them at the door with a third-party inspector beside me, clipboard in hand. And I made it clear that the clock was running, the walkthrough would be completed, and the keys would be returned before the deadline, because deadlines, unlike family loyalties, do not bend when someone starts crying or raising their voice. Jenna immediately began pointing at marks on the wall and scratches on the floor, insisting that they had been there before they moved in, as though saying it aloud could erase the fact that we had taken move-in photos 3 years ago that told the truth in perfect color. And every time she tried to shift blame, the inspector calmly noted her comments, photographed the area, and reminded her that deductions for damages would be calculated according to the lease addendum she herself had signed. Evan, seeing that his wife's performance was not gaining traction, shifted to the subject of his business mail, demanding access to the locked box where several notices were waiting, notices he had ignored for weeks, hoping they would magically vanish if he pretended not to see them, and I reminded him, in front of the inspector, that the pickup window had been sent in writing and had already passed, which meant the mail was scheduled for return to sender per postal regulations, and if his compliance deadline was about to collapse, that was not my emergency to solve. He muttered something about lawyers and unfair treatment, but the fact that he was standing in a house that no longer belonged to him while a stranger wrote down every detail of the interaction stripped his words of the force they once carried. And for the first time I could see in his eyes that he understood what accountability actually felt like. Mom tried one last desperate play, calling me mid-walk-through and asking me to please just give them one more week, because Jenna was in a fragile state after the stress of moving, and I said firmly, with the inspector listening, that extensions were only granted in writing with a full deposit equal to 1 month of market rent, and since they did not have that, the conversation was over. It was not cruel, it was adult, and the difference between the two is something my family had spent years trying to blur, but I was done confusing self-destruction with kindness. When the final checklist was signed, I asked for the keys, and Jenna threw them on the counter with a dramatic sigh, trying to frame herself as the victim in front of the inspector, but the gesture meant nothing to me, because I had already booked the locksmith, already confirmed the time slot, and already prepared the new lease for a tenant who had references, income, and respect for agreements. I walked them to the door, watched them leave without ceremony, and closed it behind them with a sense of closure that no apology could ever provide, because apologies without change are just noise, and I was finally free of noise. 2 hours later, while the locksmith was finishing the last lock and testing the keys, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize, and when I picked up, it was the registered agent for Evan's business, informing me that their compliance clock had expired and they needed a new address immediately or the business would be flagged, which told me in no uncertain terms that the little empire he had built on my generosity was already crumbling in real time. And the irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh, because while they had been sipping cocktails on a Hawaiian beach and congratulating themselves on excluding me, the very structure of their security was collapsing because they had forgotten the simplest truth of all. You cannot build stability on a foundation you do not own. That night, I sent one final message to the family group chat, not a rant, not a speech, not an explanation designed to win sympathy, but a single sentence that carried the full weight of 3 years of patience finally closing its books, lease concluded as of today. All personal items left have been inventoried and stored according to the signed addendum. And then I muted the thread, silenced the notifications, and let the room fill with the quiet hum of my own life returning to me. In the silence that followed, I understood that the power they once held over me was never rooted in money or property or even family loyalty, but in the belief that I would always bend to avoid conflict, and the moment I chose not to bend, The entire illusion shattered, leaving them scrambling and me standing exactly where I should have been all along, inside my own house with keys that finally belonged only to me. The morning after the locks were changed, when the air in the house felt like it had finally remembered who it belonged to, my phone started lighting up in waves that would once have sent me into frantic damage control. Because the messages stacked one over another with a speed that used to mean I was about to be cornered into apologizing for needs I did not create. Yet this time I watched the screen with a kind of steady detachment that did not come from cruelty, but from the simple discovery. That peace is a boundary, not a personality trait, and boundaries do not answer calls they did not invite. Jenna tried everything she had in her playbook, beginning with the wounded monologue about family bonds and holiday heartlessness, moving into the performative indignation about how I had made them homeless, which would have been funny if it were not so familiar, and finally settling on threats about lawyers and reputation, and how this would not look good if people found out, but I stayed. With my new rule that communication happens in writing and only about facts, so I replied once with a short, boring email that restated the date of termination, confirmed the storage inventory numbers, and outlined the retrieval window for the boxes they had left behind, and then I ended with a single line that I knew she would hate because it left no room for a fight she could win. All future communication must be limited to written requests regarding property or genuine emergencies, and any other messages will not receive a response. Mom, who has always believed that avoiding conflict is the same as loving people well, called with a trembling voice and asked what it would take for me to undo this and let the family heal. And I said something I have never allowed myself to say out loud because I knew it would change the landscape forever, which is that healing without accountability is just another cycle waiting to begin again, and that if she wanted to understand what it would take, she could start by acknowledging that I had been paying the price for other people's choices for years while being called difficult the first time I said no, and that the only thing I am willing to undo is my role as the family cushion who quietly absorbs everyone's fall. She cried, and I listened, and for once I did not promise to make it easier, because making it easier is the trick that kept me locked in a house I owned with people who treated my generosity like a birthright, and I am tired of tricks. That afternoon, I met the new tenant at the kitchen counter, a travel nurse who works night shifts and values quiet more than small talk, and she handed me a cashier's check for the first month and the deposit with a matter-of-fact nod that felt like a benediction. Because this was not a rescue, not a favor, not an extension that would sprawl into years. This was an agreement between adults who respect the paper they sign, and when she asked about the trash pickup day and the parking space, I felt this wave of relief that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with order, because when you stop letting chaos call itself family loyalty, the ordinary logistics of life begin to feel like grace. I sent a short note to my parents with a timeline and scanned copies of the receipts and move-out photos, not to win an argument, but to leave no room for the narrative that always paints me as impulsive and cold. And I told them I would be stepping back from group chats and extended family plans for at least half a year, that any urgent news could be emailed, and that I wished them well while they figured out how to be a family without a designated scapegoat. Jenna did not give up right away, because people who are used to winning by sheer persistence never stop when the first door closes, so she tried the public route with a vague social post about a heartless sister who threw her out during the holidays. And I felt the familiar tug to explain and defend and clear the record. Except I did nothing, because the record that matters is not the one on a social feed. It is the one with dates and signatures and meter photos, and the truth has a way of holding the line even when the crowd is noisy, and besides, reputations built on manipulation are brittle things that crack the moment they have to carry weight. When Evan finally wrote me to ask for a forwarding address for his business, because his compliance had lapsed and the fines were starting to land, I replied with a single sentence directing him to the state's online portal and reminded him that my address was no longer available for any purpose. I did not gloat and I did not console, because both are a form of intimacy I no longer owe. In the quiet that followed, I realized the real win was never the lock or the lease or the storage inventory, though each of those mattered. The real win was that I had stopped begging to be treated with the bare minimum of respect and had started requiring it. And the strange part was that the world did not end when I stopped carrying other people's consequences. It simply rearranged itself around the space I finally took up. For the first time in years, I slept without my phone on the pillow waiting for a crisis I would be expected to solve. And in the morning I made coffee and read the new lease again, not because I was worried, but because I liked the way the lines looked when they were honored. And I understood something so simple it almost felt like a trick, that people who call you cruel for protecting your life are really angry that their favorite door has closed. Mom asked me one more time what it would take for us to feel like family again, and I told her I was not playing that game anymore, that I am open to truth in writing, to amends that come with changed behavior, to boundaries that apply to everyone and not just to me, and that until then I will be quiet by choice, not by exile, which is a different kind of silence altogether. They wanted a holiday with no drama, and what they got instead was a new year with consequences, and if you are wondering whether I regret any of it, whether a part of me misses the role I used to play, the answer is no. Because I finally learned the difference between being needed and being used, and I chose the one that lets me keep my keys, my calendar, and my sanity.